Hello, we're here talking to Nottingham-based guitarist Aaron Gidney from Grace and Fire. He's a classically trained musician, but a heavy metal guitarist and a prog rock aficionado. And I wanted to talk a little bit today about extended range guitars, the weird idiosyncrasies of playing extended range instrument, how we can kind of pick one up and get to learning it, especially when there aren't all that many resources available for it. So, being that you've got a classical background, but you're also a heavy metal guitarist, could you talk a little bit about your instrumental repertoire?
That sounds very posh, Dan. Thank you.
It does. It's a $5. When you use the $5 words, it raises the class of everything.
Just allegedly.
Yeah, I'm charging extra for this.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I was brought up on classical music. Mother was a piano teacher, so naturally ended up teaching me. Went through a lot of the grades and then ended up in various orchestras in Yorkshire, where I went to school. So that was playing trumpet. So again, went through the grades on that. Was in the York area schools symphony orchestra and concert band for a few years. Then was corrupted by heavy metal. So,
but that's starting out with trumpet as your main instrument. Piano or guitar seem to be the usual suspect, but trumpet's an interesting one to start on.
Yeah. Well, I think my school had a good peripatetic trumpet teacher. My grandfather was in New Orleans style jazz band, so it kind of was encouraged early on, and I think he gave me a cornet, I think, to start off with, and then that morphed into trumpet, and then obviously playing in different brass bands and orchestras and that kind of thing. So yeah.
At what point did it all go wrong and you picked up the electric guitar?
Well, I think I think the first time I picked up the guitar, well, actually, I went straight to bass, actually. I had no interest in the electric guitar. I was fascinated by a lot of early Rush, and obviously Geddy Lee's bass lines were just insane, really. So I think that was probably the first time I was exposed to bass as a lead instrument, if you like. So I actually started off playing bass and then quickly got bored of that. And then I think one of my parents' friends introduced me to Genesis. And then, there was quite a lot of intricate guitar work on albums such as Selling England by the Pound. And I think that's when I kind of started an interest in moving from bass into the guitar arena.
But you went straight into the electric world. You never came up through classical guitar or anything like that?
No, never played classical guitar in my life. My dad played the acoustic and was very proficient on that, but it was more kind of chords rather than a folky style. So never kind of gravitated towards acoustic. And then gradually, I think one of my other friends introduced me to the early Manic Street Preachers albums, which were quite, I wouldn't say heavy metal, but more hard rock. And I think that's where I probably first got the interest in exploring electric guitar with, distortion and solos and that kind of thing.
I think it's a bit of a kind of a loaded question almost. Learning trumpet as a child, that kind of dictates the way that we tend to learn. But did you find that you approached the guitar the same way you did, or the bass the same way you did trumpet?
No, the exact opposite actually. The with trumpet, because it was all classical or marching band kind of stuff. It's all obviously it's sheet music, so. That was kind of ingrained in me in terms of my classical side of my brain. When I picked up bass, I tended to actually move straight to kind of playing by ear. So I picked things up by ear and then eventually ended up with, tabs and stuff for more intricate bass. parts. But yeah, it's interesting really in hindsight, because I didn't really apply the classical training, sight reading, sheet music, all of that kind of thing to playing the bass. It was
it's interesting that the guitar or guitar instruments seem to lend themselves a bit more to a slightly more intuitive approach rather than a structured scales and arpeggios kind of thing, which seems a bit weird because I would have thought that kind of intuitive approach would be more useful for trumpet, where the embouchures are a little bit more intangible compared to fifth fret on the E string of guitar.
Yeah, I think that's it's it's a strange one really, because I think because the style of music I was playing in orchestras and concert bands and stuff was so strict, if you like. You had your first, a second, and third trumpets and that kind of thing. It was there was no manoeuvre for kind of going rogue or anything like that. I think it would have been different if I'd been in a jazz band where there's a bit more room for kind of improvisation and playing to the chord changes rather than strict notation. So I think it could have been a slightly different journey, but it's I think you tend to kind of gravitate towards the thing that you learn first, or the learning method you learn first. So I think over time I've actually I've found it quite hard to improvise. I can pick things up. If I hear a song or something, I can learn a riff or play along with it reasonably well. But if you stuck me in like a freeform jazz band, I'd be screwed, because my musical learning I think probably hindered me from going down the freeform approach. So I have found it very difficult to adapt, and in an ironic way I've had to kind of learn how to improvise, which is that's a paradox within itself really. But I've had to spend a lot of time looking at players like Pat Metheny, Frank Gambale, Alan Holdsworth, who were great improvisers, and actually try and pick up some of their learning methods.
There's a terrific Alan Holdsworth interview where he said that he refused to audition people who would learn parts. He would make sure that whenever he auditioned anyone, he would just force them to play something they'd never had any kind of experience with at all before, to see how they, the player, react. Because then you can listen to he describes it as listening to the player's history. And then he went on to talk about John Coltrane as a player with utterly no history of legendary practice of all this kind of stuff. So with all this in mind, this kind of forms the backdrop to the question at hand. How did you go down the dark path of picking up a Chapman Stick? Because we want to talk about kind of extended range instruments today. So Or I think perhaps a kind of a more to the point question is where did you, having discovered electric guitar and bass and that kind of thing, where did you first see an extended range instrument?
So the first time I was aware of the Chapman Stick was my mum and dad had a VHS of the Celtic progressive rock band Iona. I think that was around maybe 1990, 91 maybe, and he used to have it on in the house quite a lot, and their guitar player Dave Bainbridge was absolutely fantastic. He played jazz, metal, lead guitar, which was just utterly fascinating to me. And I think the more I watched this video, the more I noticed that there was a chap on the other side of the stage who was playing what looked like just a piece of wood from a coffee table and thoroughly enjoying himself. And that turned out to be Nick Beggs.
The man appears everywhere.
Who I think most prog fans will recognise him from Stephen Wilson and Steve Hackett's band. But back in the day, he I think he was one of the early pioneers of Stick. Prior to him becoming a bit of a prog legend, he was in a pop band called Kajagoogoo, who had the number one hit Too Shy. And I believe that for their second album, Islands, I believe he got a Chapman Stick in exchange for becoming the band's lead singer. So, I was first kind of drawn towards the Stick because of Nick Beggs, really. And he looked, whilst he was playing with Iona, he looked so cool. He looked so new agey and hippie. You know, he had long hair. He didn't wear shoes.
A look that surely won't have dated.
Yes, yeah, and he just looked like he was having a thoroughly good time. And I think what my ears heard was a bass guitar, but what my eyes saw was this fantastic, weird, otherworldly instrument that involved two hands and tapping it rather than strumming it like a guitar. And I just thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen and heard.
See, I kind of first discovered it on Tony Levin playing Chapman on King Crimson's Discipline. But it took me quite a long time to go from listening to it and hearing a very interesting kind of guitar-y, bassy kind of sound to realizing that it was a Chapman Stick rather than a guitar or bass. And again, it's exactly what it was like you were saying. It was kind of, to see it is quite a weird thing. I have a kind of ulterior motive for this whole conversation, and I've recently picked up envious of your Chapman Stick. I wanted a Chapman Stick, but I couldn't afford it. And so I thought I'd buy an 8-string guitar instead. But I managed to bag a 9-string Ibanez RG9, which I'm very, very happy with. But it's a frightening thing to look at. Extended range instruments are quite intimidating. And I think that's probably in large part because they're relatively few and far between. Now, you were talking about kind of famous Chapman Stick players. Nick Beggs and Tony Levin covers about half. Trey Gunn.
Yes.
I think that's pretty much all the Chapman Stick players I could ever name, excluding yourself.
And that's debatable.
But it's an interesting thing, the kind of the impact of such a small number of musicians on the musical world. The Chapman Stick is quite certainly among prog rock fans, a relatively well-known thing. I think speaking in much broader terms, if we're going to kind of codify, contemporary extended range instruments, and that's going to rule out, 5-string lutes and ouds and sazzes and all these kind of things. If we're going to say, okay, we're going to exclusively talk about electric guitar and electric guitar-like instruments. The Chapman Stick. We spoke briefly about the war guitar the other day. I thought we could Kelstone, which is war guitar, is similar to a Chapman Stick, but closer to a guitar and a bass kind of stuck together. A Kelstone is more like a guitar that ate a piano. Just a similar to a lap steel, but slightly different. If we're going to kind of just talk about, cover all the ground, I mean, that also then includes 12-string guitars, 7, 8, and 8-string guitars as well. There's a bit of a kind of interesting kind of, curve to it, because 12-string guitars are kind of seen as, well, first of all, instant 1970s prog and instant folk. But it's not particularly difficult to play a 12-string as compared to a 6-string. Have you kind of found this? The skills translate relatively well. What,
in terms of playing 12-string? Yeah, I think. I mean, again, I think because I was introduced to early Genesis early on in my musical education, if you like, I I did gravitate more towards 12 string, and I liked the chime like quality of the sound, which you don't get with the acoustic.
No.
So I think I found 12 string a bit easier to grasp, actually, ironically, than a 6 string, because I think the 12 string is very good at covering a multitude of sins in terms of, poor playing technique, just simply because there's more notes being played, and it's louder, and it's a fuller sound.
I think it's
and
closer. It's closer to the sound you're imagining in your head a lot of the time than
Yeah.
necessarily maybe a acoustic or electric guitar is.
Yeah,
but of course,
absolutely. Yeah, and I think it lends itself to slightly more melodic playing, I think, than an acoustic, a 6 string.
well, of course,
So
the 12 string is not a misnomer, but a 12 string guitar is just a 6 string guitar, but with every string doubled an octave higher.
yeah.
So in a sense, it still plays and feels not the same as, but certainly similar to a 6 string. In a way that extended range instruments, they feel a little bit harder to translate across. How was your experience picking up the Chapman Stick for the first time?
Well, I think because I learned piano first, and that's the whole concept of having to use 2 hands, playing different things, bass part in the left, melody with it right. I think it was probably slightly easier for me than, say, if I'd have just played electric guitar, because it's a completely different technique. You don't strum, or well, you can, but you're not really supposed to. That's not what it's designed for. But so I found the transition reasonably. I wouldn't say easy, because it's not an easy instrument to learn, but I understood the concept of it probably a little bit easier than some might. And also, when I was learning how to play bass, I got quite bored of standard bass lines, U2 style bass lines where it's just,
root note and eighth notes.
Dull. Yeah, absolutely, which are fantastic and obviously serve the song and stuff. But I found myself trying to emulate some of the Chapman Stick techniques that I'd heard on some of those early Iona albums. So I think it was a natural progression for me, because I always enjoyed kind of playing those kind of chords on the bass with the left hand, and then maybe playing something a bit more melodic with the right hand. So it was a natural gravitation. So I did try and translate a lot of those ideas over to the bass. Now, clearly, there's a limit if you've got 4 strings and only 20 frets or something like that. So, but it served a purpose. And just help me get into that mindset of having to use 2 different hands to play 2 different things.
Conceptually, it's similar to piano, but from a technique point of view, it's totally different, isn't it? It's quite a learning curve to that. I found it in the way that piano feels quite natural and intuitive.
Yeah, well, I think the broad concept is the same. It's the logistics of it much different, because the way that you play chord shapes are slightly unnatural. Even if you've played guitar, there's strings are upside down and different octaves than what your brain is hearing them as, and you've got fourths in the bass side and fifths in the. So yeah, the actual logistics of the playing style are completely different to the piano. However, it is a piano-like instrument in that you've got two distinct, ends. You've got the bass, you've got the melody, and the purpose of it is to be able to do both on the same instrument. So but it's not a naturally easy instrument to learn at all. So
with that in mind, I'm interested to know how you approached it, knowing that there is all this. In theory, there's all this guitar stuff that might work, and there's also this piano stuff that should work. But trying to make those pieces fit is an absolute nightmare, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's it's one of those instruments that takes a very long time to learn,
to break, to get over the initial hump, perhaps.
Yeah, because I think in some ways, if you have learned guitar or bass or any other string instrument like that, you've got to rewire your brain essentially, because what you see and hear, is just completely alien. So I think, I think the way I started was I picked some of the easier Chapman Stick examples and just tried to kind of break them down. Really good one is the breakdown section in Dream Theater's A New Millennium from Falling into Infinity, where John Mayall is playing a Chapman Stick. And it's a really simple line, which is, I think most people would just assume it's on the bass, but
I think I did. I think I did assume that.
Yeah. It's not obvious until you hear every couple of bars he's playing a chord, which people I think probably thought was a guitar going through a wah-wah pedal or a Fender.
I suppose that's a dead giveaway with even if he's playing a sixth string, it's hard to kind of voice chords and melody like that.
Yeah, so that was a particular excerpt which I found reasonably straightforward to play, because the bass line isn't complicated, and then the chord he's playing is literally, it's a bar chord. So it's just a one finger job. So the concept of that piece of music, I think, was a good entry point. But again, it's harder than you think, simply because when you've got a Chapman Stick, as most guitar players know on their own instruments, that there's fret markers. Now on the Chapman Stick, there's very few fret markers, and they're in completely the wrong place to what your brain thinks. So it's one of those things where if you're about to play a chord like the chord John Mayall is playing in that particular excerpt, you have to think ahead and actually visualize what fret you're going to play, rather than just naturally put your hand where you think it should be, because if you get the wrong one, it's the wrongest of wrongs. So it takes a great deal of kind of hand-eye coordination, and the added difficulty is when you're playing stick, you're stood up. So if you're playing melody parts with your right hand, well, the higher the part, the closer to the ground your hand has to go. And because it's not with
in that sense,
guitar,
it's similar to a guitar, isn't it?
Well, no, not really, because when you're playing guitar and it's horizontal to you, so in essence, you can see all of the frets with your left eye or your right eye. You can see them all, everything is within reach. When you're stood up and the actual frets you're having to play are further away from your eyes and your hands as well, it takes quite an adjustment, I think, because it feels completely unnatural, and the lack of fret markers is a real pain in the backside sometimes.
Now, you're normally quite diligent on guitar about all the scales and arpeggios and that kind of thing. Did you find yourself going through the scales and arpeggios process on the stick?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say I've really explored arpeggios that much. Scales, yes, mainly with the right-hand melody side of the stick, because that's what you'll need to learn in order to play melodies. You know, you need some either basic scale knowledge or at least an ear for how it sounds and looks, how to play it. So yeah, I think fortunately because the melody side is in fifths, it's fairly straightforward box shapes, if you like, which is similar to a guitar, really. Terms of
fifths tend to lend themselves to wider voicings because they're obviously tuned further apart. Did that kind of affect the way you tend to play at all, as compared to guitar, or think perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I struggled with early on was just the adaptability of muscles in your fingers. I did find that a bit strange to adapt to, because I would say that most guitar players would tend to play kind of 3 notes per string kind of thing. And Chapman Stick, it's slightly different, really. So it does take a little bit of time just to kind of, again, rewire your thinking and playing melodies in such a way that your brain is not telling you it's the same pentatonic shape as on a guitar. So it's,
the horizontal and vertical movements are totally different between the two instruments.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So on the right-hand melody side of the stick, you are ascending up the scale. So whereas on the bass side of the stick, it's actually upside down, which is again, that's a brain rewire issue, because in concept it's completely what's the word, it makes sense, really does, because if they were going the same way, you'd end up kind of running into each other. So that way your hands are actually going away from each other.
That's a problem I've had playing scales. I've approached the 9-string again as a poor man's Chapman Stick for sure. I'm trying to play kind of two-handed tapping parts. I've been trying to work through certainly all the kind of scale patterns, and trying to play scales hands together. I find that unless I'm playing 2 octaves apart, I find it very, very difficult to avoid the hands crashing into each other and muting each other, that kind of thing. And I'm convinced that it's not just my shoddy technique. I think that the instrument it's much harder to try and play an octave separate rather than 2 octaves separate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the genius things behind the design of the stick is that it was, it was designed ergonomically to ensure that your hands aren't bumping into each other, and they are, they're going away from each other. They're separate.
And of course, it was designed. It was very, very much, very heavily designed to fit the purpose as a touch instrument, rather than something like guitar, which obviously has got 1,000-year lineage, or if you want to get into that, it's a whole different discussion. The interesting question is, well, what can a Chapman stick do that a 6-string classical guitar can't? Because a lot of classical players will say yes, but you can have multiple voices playing. You can certainly play 3-voice Bach on a classical guitar without excluding the technical challenge of it. It's not a practical challenge to the instrument to play multiple voices on guitar. But technically, it's a little strange to try and fit that all into a single fretting hand and then a single picking hand. Whereas on the Chapman stick, I suppose it lends itself to 2-voice playing very, very comfortably.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think because it's quite clearly it's 2 instruments in one. There's a clear division between the bass side, and I mean the bass side goes as low as C, I think.
That's a C below bass guitar E.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, and so yeah, I mean it's because it's also a stereo instrument as well.
I didn't know that.
Yes, it's a stereo instrument. So the input and the pickup is a stereo pickup. So in terms of chord voicings, you can obviously play the same chord voicings in the bass and on the melody side, but also because the string gauges are completely different, and because it's in stereo, and you can assign each part of the stick to a different effect on your gear. It gives you so much wider scope to be able to play full accompaniments with distinct sounds all on the same instrument. So like I said, you could technically play the same chords on the melody side and the bass, but because of the fingerings, because of the gauges of strings, because of the stereo nature of it, it's two completely distinct voicings, which just gives it so much more scope and expansiveness against a guitar or someone who can tap on the guitar or whatever.
But curiously, it doesn't feel like certainly in listening to stick players, it doesn't. It's quite as we kind of discussed, it's hard to spot with the ear if you're not sure what you're listening for. Whereas if you take a lot of, I mean, if we're talking about the broader family of extended range guitars, 8-string guitars, harp guitars, they feel like they serve. You can kind of, in the case of harp guitars, you can very clearly hear, okay, and here is the bass part of the guitar, and here is the treble part of the guitar. 8-string guitars or extended range guitars, they all feel a lot more cohesive in terms of this fitting in a single slot, although their range is extended slightly from the original kind of 6-string guitar range. The Chapman stick, it doesn't feel like when you're listening to a Chapman player, you're expecting to hear somebody who's going to cover the entire range of sound on their own. The solo repertoire for it is relatively thin on the ground if we're thinking about the impact of the instrument as a whole. Excluding the kind of new standard crafty guitarist kind of circle, of which all Chapman stick players seem to be a part of.
Yeah, it's like what you alluded to at the start of the podcast. There's a handful of stick players that people are aware of, but it's almost like one of those music industry secrets, if you know kind of thing. Now, I think if you're cute in terms of knowing what a stick sounds like, the techniques behind it, the kind of chord voicings you get, it's quite easy to actually pick out when a stick player is. So I was introduced to stick by Nick Beggs, so I knew what the stick sounded like before I heard Tony Levin with King Crimson. And as soon as I heard the opening of Discipline, which is Elephant Talk, I knew immediately it was a stick.
See, that for me, that eluded me for a long time. It's not quite a guitar, but I couldn't believe that it was anything except until I saw it.
Yeah, but I think once you kind of start becoming obsessed with the sound like I did, you can actually feel the sound. You can feel the technique of the tapping.
It's a very tactile thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
in a way that even guitar isn't. Even with the feeling of picking and that kind of thing, it's totally different to the two-handed touch approach. Yeah,
it is. There is a distinct sound to the Chapman Stick, which is quite clear if you know what you're looking for. You think it's a bass, but it's not quite. And it's and that's the difference between someone fretting a string and playing it with a finger or a pick, and then someone tapping it. There is a distinct feel and like you said,
a musical texture.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's absolutely unique. And even if you hear someone playing guitar and tapping, Joe Satriani, Day at the Beach, that's a classic, clean tap it, and that's, you could play it on stick, but they would sound completely different because there's just a different feel to it.
It lends itself to the legato a little bit more than guitar, I've found.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Well, it has to be because you're not plucking strings.
Well, yeah.
So it's all legato.
Sorry, you're going to say something.
No, it's all right.
I lost my thought. Now let me just quickly pick up my thread.
That's all right.
Go through notes. So a lot of the names, we've kind of dropped here musically. It's all, I think, with the exception of Nick Beggs and Kajagoogoo, it very much all fits within the domain of the prog.
It does.
And is there any hope for the Chapman Stick or extended range instruments in general to be to be found outside of that? Because to wit, the only examples I can think of extended range instruments outside of prog or progressive metal or broadly speaking, heavy metal or this kind of thing. And in the context of heavy metal, it really does feel like we're doing guitar but one louder, so to speak. The only exception I can think of is the kind of acoustic, particularly percussive acoustic types. Michael Hedges, Andy McKee, John Gomm. Specifically, I spoke to him a couple of years ago, and he specifically said he's not interested in it because he thinks he can get enough out of just a 6-string guitar, and of course the man does. He's fantastic. But it's hard to conjure genres of music besides progressive rock and besides solo musicians that tend toward these kind of extended range guitar instruments. There's a couple of reasons why that is. I think in terms of logistics, they're difficult instruments to get a hold of, and then expensive instruments to get a hold of as well.
Very, very. Yeah, I think that whilst it would be nice for Chapman Stick to be more, or other extended range instruments to be more mainstream, I genuinely don't think it will ever happen because I think, logistics. So Chapman Sticks and other tapping instruments are very exclusive. They've got small production runs. I would probably guess that 100% of the instruments are bespoke, custom made for each customer. They tend to come from the States. Obviously, Chapman is a brand which are based in California, so there's the logistic issues there. I think in terms of its appeal, I think it's a classic case of, because it's a complicated, weird, unusual instrument, it just won't appeal to mainstream users. It's unfortunately it is the lowest common denominator issue, which tends to come up, which is why your stick users, and there are plenty of other stick users who don't play prog. There's a lot of stick users who do like arrangements of Beatles melodies, and
you're thinking in a solo context.
Yeah, in a solo context, but I think it fits with the whole concept of prog. A bit of pretentiousness, a bit of musical superiority.
So you can't buy a Chapman Stick on a whim, really, can you? Or indeed any extended range instrument. There really is a learning curve to it. I think if you're playing a 6-string guitar and alternate tunings and that kind of thing, it gives you a sense of the feeling, but it's quite different to play an instrument in and of itself. And you've got to be, I think, quite dedicated to it to really get the most out of it. It's not something you can immediately kind of, unless you are doing the kind of Meshuggah lowest string possible kind of thing. Big Meshuggah fan, but I think in that context, it really is serving a singular function rather than kind of capturing the range of the instrument. That said, Frederick Thorndal does so much cool stuff with his 8-string. I think to kind of use the Meshuggah argument is kind of maybe a bit kind of diminutive. Also, you know what I mean. But trying to kind of really get to a point where you can get the appeal of an extended range instrument is quite difficult to do by picking one up and playing one. It really has to. It's something you've got to kind of really commit to in concept for a long time before you manage to make the jump.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I was, like I said earlier, I was introduced to Nick Beggs probably when I was around 9, 10. And I wasn't able to actually afford a Chapman Stick until I was probably about 25, 26. That's a long time. That is a long time, and I think, but that time gave me the opportunity to absorb what a stick is, what it does, what it sounds like, what it's used for. And if you don't go down that rabbit hole, then there's no appeal, because you just think, oh well, that's just a fancy guitar or something that's $3,500 to order. Like you say, it's not something you can order on a whim, and it's, unfortunately, it is quite an unforgiving instrument, and it needs that time, attention. A packet of strings costs about £40.
Oof.
So it's not an instrument you can just kind of buy and put in the corner and think, oh, that's nice. There's no version of Squire.
That's the thing. There's no budget range for the Chapman Stick, is there?
No, not at all.
I suppose for me, it was cheaper to buy a 9-string guitar than it was to invest in a Chapman. Of course, it's not the same instrument by any stretch, but it certainly, in my case, wanting a Chapman but needing to pay the bills, I think it gives you a bit of a taste of it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, if not all, ideas are always translatable to other instruments, and I think as a proof of concept, if you like. I think doing something like you've done is a good idea. I think Chapman Sticks, even a second hand, are virtually impossible to come by. Like I said, if you actually want the official Chapman Stick strings, you have to order them from America with the import charges in it, about £40. Or there's a company in the UK that does tapping strings, which happen to fit
the off-brand
Chapman Stick, but they're still £30. So it's not an instrument that way. If you snap a string, you can go, okay, I'll just leave it, kind of thing. It's a lot of dedication is there. And again, I think if you're going to go down the route of becoming an extended range player, I think you probably need to have an idea of what you want it to do or who you want to sound like, if you like, because there's so much scope. So like most of Tony Levin's parts on the King Crimson albums from the 80s, he doesn't do an awful lot of melody lines. It's mainly bass. He does play some chords and stuff, but there's no kind of there's not much scope for kind of solos and stuff. I mean, why would there be when you've got Adrian Belew and Robert Fripp playing elephant sounds and backwards solos and stuff? But so you can go down that route where arguably it's used as more of a bass instrument, or you can go down the Nick Beggs route where in I think it was on Iona's third album, Beyond These Shores, there's a few tracks on there which are lots of melody parts on the stick, not much bass on it. So there's I think the best example is a track called Bird of Heaven, where he plays an unaccompanied stick arrangement, which is it's quite a beast, really, because it's all arpeggios and melody lines, and it's a really beautiful piece. But so I think you need to know exactly which route. I mean, of course you can do both, but I think you need to have an idea of, okay, I want to use it as a bass instrument that can embellish with chords occasionally, or no, I want to use it as a solo, arrangement type instrument to play songs from the Beatles. So I think having that mindset before you go into it is advisable, really. I'm sure when you bought your 9-string guitar, you had an idea of what you wanted to achieve out of it, or what kind of sounds, or
initially I was after an 8-string, but I saw a 9-string going, and I thought, this is going to, for me, I think for another player perhaps they might have seen the low C sharp and thought this is probably going to get in the way of the bass player, but for me I was interested particularly in the kind of two-handed piano approach to it. But yeah, you were just talking about applying the Chapman Stick. From the outside looking in, it's easy to look at extended range instruments and kind of see, okay, well, if you've bought it, now you're just going to shove it into everything you're doing with it. But it really does take on a bit of a life of its own, as far as, going from being from a guitar player who owns a Chapman Stick to also being a Chapman Stick player and it being its own kind of mode of expression.
Yes. Yeah, I think, again, you need to kind of have a vision as to where it sits in your musical vocabulary, if you like, particularly if you're in a band like I am. There's where we're recording an album at the moment, and I did want to put a lot of Chapman Stick all over it. But again, if you're unsure as to kind of what its role is, and if you already have bass, keyboards, guitars, it becomes another problem and conundrum as to, where does it fit between those instruments? Where does it fit in the mix? Should it be all the way through the song? Should it just be, wheeled out on special occasions kind of thing?
And interestingly enough, I think that's a problem that guitarists don't face, because guitar is such a well codified instrument in terms of the way that we tend to arrange for it compositionally. Whereas Chapman Stick, okay, we're going to have the guitar, we're going to have a bass, we're going to have the keyboards, we're going to have the drum, whatever. The guitar is usually in mind, unless you're kind of including Chapman Stick from the outset, as I imagine you probably have at some point with some of your tracks. On the flip side, it's interesting because we're thinking about this from, if we're kind of straddling piano and guitar. On piano, you very much have to think about that when you're playing with the band, because the kind of, certainly octave bass kind of thing you might do in a classical piece tends not to go over so well if you're playing in a band context where you may have a bass guitarist.
Yeah.
So I suppose it comes down to a kind of a degree of perhaps self-restraint to know where it's appropriate to include the instrument and anything else. But I guess it's not. I guess that will come relatively naturally, rather than that kind of temptation to just include it everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's something I've been quite mindful of when we've been recording. So I made a conscious decision to not have stick all the way through a song. It is for those interludes or those kind of sections of songs which you want to do something a bit different with. No one wants to hear another guitar solo or another keyboard solo or another riff or whatever. And I think having it in your arsenal of tonal textures and options, it's perfect really, because it just adds that, I wouldn't necessarily say wow factor, because people don't get wowed by anything these days. But it is something different, and it is a unique selling point on anything, because it's such an exclusive instrument. And like I said earlier, if you know. So it does require some self-restraint. I think if the style of music I was playing was different, if it was, just piano and voice or something, then it is the type of instrument that would be perfect for playing all the way through, or playing a solo arrangement on something. But I think within a band context, you do have to have that self-awareness of where does it fit in the song, where does it fit in the mix, where does it fit in the band. And like I said, I think it does bring with it its own kind of conundrum if you do have those other instruments like the bass and the guitar already, because when you're adding a third stringed instrument into the mix, it can be problematic. Now, I think there's two examples of where it has worked extremely well. Clearly, the early 80s King Crimson, because there was only four of them, and Tony Levin wasn't competing against another bass. He was either playing bass or he was playing stick. So I think that's a fairly simple option, because he was a bass player who was playing stick. The other example is obviously when King Crimson went double trio, it was him and Trey Gunn playing war guitar or stick. I think the way that particular incarnation of King Crimson was designed by Robert Fripp meant that it had to work, because you had two drummers, two tapped instruments and two guitarists. So clearly we all know how much thought went into that, because it worked fairly well. But I think
far be it for us to accuse a band like King Crimson of excess.
Yes, absolutely. But
I think the fact that is Tony Levin playing against Trey Gunn, both of them understand the stick and of course the war guitar. So I imagine that would have given them quite a lot of ability to make the best of two extended range players rather than simply clashing against each other. I think a slightly more broadly speaking, a slightly more normal sounding kind of arrangement rather than the King Crimson double trio. Of course, Animals as leaders being a band where everyone plays 8 strings, and I remember seeing them being like, "Well, hold on a minute, there's no bass player here," because of course when everyone's on extended range guitars, you don't really need it all that much. But again, that kind of when you kind of pick the parts apart, you can kind of see that they're very clearly split between a kind of a conscious bass voice and a melody voice, and a lot of the time, certainly in Animals as leaders, that can happen within a single guitarist, and then there's another guitar playing in addition to that. But the roles are quite clearly defined.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm not. I'll be honest, and probably slightly controversial. I don't like Animals as leaders at all.
Nobody's perfect. Nobody's perfect.
No, I don't. I've heard a lot of the tracks, but I think because I've probably got a bit of an older school view on extended range instruments, just being exposed to the stick from 1990 kind of era. I don't like the music I've heard from Animals leaders, and I actually think in some ways it's been I wouldn't say dangerous, but it's perhaps gone down a musical route, I think, which I think is probably the wrong one in my controversial and not so humble opinion.
I think it's certainly easy to look at animals as leaders and see low-tuned guitars and slightly dodgy rhythms and to pick up potentially the wrong musical message from that in order to make the music good, we need to have low-tuned guitars and weird rhythms and not the musicality of it, which is in my mind the exact same musicality that you would have to kind of cultivate in any genre of music on any set of instruments, rather than specifically them being kind of having a good sound because there is an extended range instrument there. And
perhaps I'm being a little bit unkind. I don't necessarily think it's their fault. I think the style of music and I guess the cult of personality it's perhaps encouraged in terms of
I think it's possibly the next generation of progressive rock snob around that a little bit. And then, of course, with the internet, everyone, no matter what you say, you're not only wrong, but you're an arsehole for thinking it.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think it's kind of pushed certainly musical taste and instrument buying as well, more importantly, down a particular road which I'm not too sure is entirely healthy.
Certainly headless. I'm a big fan of headless guitars, to be fair. I thought you were going to suggest there's quite it's almost a meme online to see guitars that have one more string than the last one, and it's difficult for me to criticize that, being that I own a 9-string guitar, but those kind of things seem to miss the purpose of an extended range instrument.
I think because a lot of the roots of that style of, and you can perhaps disagree with me, does lie in Meshuggah. I think with any genre of music which kind of blows up, so to speak, you tend to end up getting the lowest common denominator, which will be legions of young musicians playing ones and zeros on a 9-string guitar, rather than perhaps looking at what could be the sonic capabilities of it more akin to what the Chapman Stick does, if that makes sense. I think, like you say, you can't go online and not see a headless 9-string carving. I've not got anything against carving, by the way. It's interesting because I think with any kind of musical explosion, there's always kind of the negative sycophantic behaviour, which I think can possibly spoil what the original intention was from some of the early creators. Because, for instance, Sugar, most people I know will associate them with playing super down-tuned, ridiculously technical riffs without appreciating some of the Holdsworthian chord work that they play. And
it's almost like you can kind of get the wrong message from listening to that and miss out on what makes it musically exciting.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's where perhaps Animals as leaders and other bands in that kind of sphere, if you like, have put me off it a bit, really. So
I think that if you're talking about kind of legions of fans rushing out to buy extended range guitars, I think it's important to kind of there is that kind of that temptation to if I've bought this instrument, then I've got to use it. Once you buy the 8-string guitar, you don't not play the 7 and 8 strings, do you? But I suppose it's important to maintain that broader kind of musical perspective, especially if you're playing with a band. The novelty wears off, but the musicality does not.
Yeah, I think the novelty is probably what I take issue with. So I think it probably reached its peak. Was it last year or the year before when that idiot Jared Dines had a super duper 26-string instrument made? I don't know how many strings it was, but it just looked absolutely ridiculous. You can't play it.
At that point, it seemed to make more sense to play something more akin to a zither, or a harp, where there are lots and lots of strings, but it's expected that you would play them. They wouldn't be tuned in a guitar sense; they'd be tuned in a more thing. And at that point, you've got to say, well, clearly this is not a 26-string guitar. It's a 26-string something, but to label it as a guitar seems to be missing the point of the construction. And I think it's possible that Jared Deans knows that, but of course in that context, again, that kind of the guitar with extra strings has very much become this kind of internet meme almost.
Well, yeah, and I think that was the point where I thought, okay, it's become a joke now because, oh, look, I've got this ridiculously sized guitar. And then that appeals to the legions of sycophantic followers who think, oh, I'm going to do that as well so I can look stupid and have this ridiculous monstrosity of an instrument. And I think it for me, it takes away from the I suppose the sacredness of the stick and the war guitar, which
it's as you said, it's quite an investment to try and learn one of these instruments rather than just try and take guitar and play it but on lower strings or this kind of thing.
Yeah,
with that in mind,
it's lost art. It's lost art as such.
It's easy to kind of understand why you'd want to, if you buy an instrument like that, you want to kind of put it into everything. And it's tempting to be disappointed by the reality that you can't. But I think you'll probably agree. You can't really buy an instrument like that in order to play it on records. It very much is a personal endeavor to pick up an instrument like that and to learn it for oneself, for one's own satisfaction, rather than to fill any musical niche.
Yeah. Yeah, it's. Carry on.
No, you carry.
No, because I'll just get more grumpy, I think.
So, with that in mind, how long did it take you to go from a Chapman Stick owner to a Chapman Stick player?
That's a very difficult question to quantify. I would not call myself a Chapman Stick player.
But you are a person, you are a musician who plays the Chapman Stick.
Well, yes and no. So when I kind of try and play stick, and then I see some of these real musicians who can play stick. You know, there's some fantastic stick players who are perhaps unsung. I think there's Greg Howard and Steve Adelson who do some fantastic stick arrangements. And when I see them playing and then see my own struggles, I wouldn't put myself in the same category. You know, if I was to compare it to driving a car, I've probably got my provisional license at the moment.
They're further down a path that you have only just begun to walk.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, I own a stick. I can play things on the stick. I can perform and record things that I hear in my head that I need translating onto stick. But I wouldn't necessarily call myself a stick player just yet. I think
and with so many barriers to entry, I think it's probably important to bear in mind that you're probably still in the up there as far as stick players, simply by virtue of you using it as a instrument that you perform and record on.
Yeah. I think. Well, I think at the end of the day, proof is in the pudding. Really, I'm notoriously averse to playing live. As you know, when we played together, it's not my thing. I don't enjoy it. So I'm much happier being able to, in my own time, translate things onto the stick, record them as many times as I want, screw up as many times as I want, and get those final results that make me feel happy. It would be a different story if I was shoved in front of a crowd and said, right, play something now. I think I'd probably die. So there's
finding a crowd of people who are excited to cheer for a Chapman Stick is a challenge in and of itself.
Yeah, there's actually, interestingly enough, there's a guy who plays on the London Underground in some of the stations who's a fantastic stick player, and he clearly enjoys it and makes a lot of money from it. But yeah, it's
it has to be the enjoyment.
Yeah, I think for me it's one of those things that's very personal to me, and I get a bit embarrassed when people I know say, "Oh, play something on the stick for us," big man. And I think that's where I kind of think, "Oh no, that's not me." So I think there are degrees of stick playability, and I think to label yourself as a stick player would probably be slightly pretentious. I own a stick and I can play things on the stick, but I wouldn't call myself a stick player necessarily, not in the traditional sense anyway, because when you label yourself as something, you automatically are categorized with other stick players. Well, if you look at who the other stick players are, I can't play stick. I just own one. So it's
further down the road.
But further down the frets, I think. If we're looking at the stick as a totem pole-esque thing, but it's there is quite a tight knit stick community. I think at one point on the I can't remember the name of the stick for it. It might be just a Stickist or something like that. They someone actually has a list of who owns which serial number of stick. starting one kind of thing. So it's
a small club. It's an exclusive club, isn't it?
It is. And again, it's it's a bit of a closed society, really, which again I think appeals to a lot of people, because it is so exclusive. You're not going to, walk into a music venue somewhere with loads of other support bands and bump into someone else who happens to play stick. So in some ways, I suppose that's where the ego comes into it, because you don't know anyone who owns one. No one else will be able to ever afford one. There's only a few people who probably listen to Iona and King Crimson and Trey Gunn and Nick Beggs or whoever. So it's a niche within a niche within a niche, which for someone like me is absolutely fantastic.
Perfect,
There's nothing more I hate than bumping into other people who say, "Oh yeah, I've got the same guitar as you." So it's ideal for people who do want that.
For rock and roll nerds.
No, it is. It is a niche within a niche within a niche, which is how it should be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If we start wrapping up then, well, there is some Chapman Stick to be heard on the forthcoming Grace and Fire album.
Yes, there will be. So I was doing... I'm in the process of just finishing the last rough mixes, and I've put together one of those musical progress charts where you can put little tick boxes in, and I think in my own mind I thought I've made it now, because I've got a column that says Chapman Stick, and I thought yes, I've made it to the big time. So yeah, at the moment it looks like there's Chapman Stick on every track. So there's 9 tracks. Oh no, there's 10 tracks at the moment. So I think the stick going to be on 8 of the tracks.
Excellent. So it's pretty strong presence across the album.
It is, but again, I've used it sparingly because we've got fantastic bass player Tim, who he doesn't need any more stick invading his sonic space. So it has been used sparingly, and I've really enjoyed kind of adding that extra instrument to what is a standard 5-piece band, and I think again it's one of those instruments that can help you kind of think outside the box. If you're thinking this part of the song just needs something different, well most people just pick up guitar or piano and end up playing the exact same thing like they've always played and go to the same shapes and chords and stuff. But
it's hard to be idiomatic on an instrument like that, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's been great for those kind of bits of inspiration where you think this just needs something slightly different. So it's been really good being able to do that, but it's been, at the same time, it has been a bit of a nightmare to record because it's a stereo instrument, and I found myself tracking each side of the instrument separately so it can go through different buses and whatever. So yeah, so look out for that.
Is there a name on the album yet? Nothing that you're legally able to disclose at this point.
Not at the moment, but
it's the next Grace and Fire album, and that's coming early next year.
Yes, yeah, it should be. So it's ready it's just about ready to be sent off for mixing. So again, I think some of it will obviously depend on pandemic kind of stuff. But yeah, it'll be out early next year, hopefully.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. I'm looking forward to hearing it, man.
Yeah, me too.